from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
It is our pleasure to bring you a two-week series on one of the great topics of our planet, and that has to do with the world's major religions. In fact, what we'd like to do on program number one is to discuss the role of the world's religions as they have affected humankind throughout many centuries, and with particular emphasis on the 20th century and what has happened. In that discussion, the time will not permit the detail that we would like, but some of the religions that we will be looking at, and to some aspects, would be Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and some other religions that deal with, for example, Native Americans or Native groups in Africa and other places. We're very, very fortunate to have today, and I'm happy to report back next week, three guests to deal with what we believe is a very, very interesting subject. I first of all welcome to the program Tom Flynn, who's a colleague at North Idaho College on the faculty, chair of the Division of Social Sciences, and his field is philosophy, but he also has a great interest and background in particular Asian religions. Tom, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to have you here. And secondly, I'm equally pleased to have Pastor Kate Lepard, who has a very distinguished background and is presently the pastor of Our Savior Lutheran Church, and certainly has a very good background in the Protestant Reformation, and that will come forth during our discussions. And Pastor Lepard, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
And equally pleased to have Dr. Ron Large, who is a member of the faculty at Gonzaga University. He teaches in the Department of Religious Studies, and he comes to us with a very distinguished academic background in ethics and philosophy and religion. And Dr. Large, it's kind of you to come to and spend this time with us today.
My pleasure, thanks.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have two regular members of our panel. First of all is Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Shink, who is the Dean of College Relations at Development North Idaho College, and as is our tradition, Janelle shall commence today's questioning.
Well, if we think of history as a continuum on which events are continually occurring, religion has, of course, been foremost in people's minds throughout the centuries. Starting with you, Dr. Large, I'd like to talk a little bit about what do you see as some of the foremost developments that have occurred in our century to add to this continuum of history?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a whole range of possibilities there, but maybe just a couple of key points. I think one of the major factors that's at work is the connection, at least from my perspective, between religion and social change, and the way that's played a dominant feature, particularly in this century. And just to give you maybe a couple of examples of that,
Yes.
I mentioned earlier before we went on the air about my work on Martin Luther King. And one of the things about Dr. King was his very strong use of religious dimensions, religious ideas, that laid the foundation for his understanding of social change and his whole development of nonviolence. Now that can work in other ways too. I mean, religion can be a force for, if we might talk about in other directions in opposition to, say, maybe nonviolence. But I think the idea is that connection between religion and social change has been really a powerful one in this century, particularly with maybe even after the Second World War with the post-colonial period and the way religion played a role in that as well.
And an example of that would be, can you give us an example?
Well, Gandhi would be another example of that, although he'd been working toward Indian independence long before the Second World War in India, but it was really after the war that began to develop and take root. And I think some of the developments in what's called liberation theology are also another dimension of that, in terms of the way religion has a role to play in at least thinking about social issues. And again, I think that cuts across both the theological and political spectrum. So it's not just simply one specific direction that's taken. It really is more multifaceted.
Well, Kate, you have been a part of some of those changes that have occurred in religion, and can you tell us a little bit about what you consider to have been some of the developments in the Protestant area of religion, Christianity in the Protestant area?
Well, Janelle, it's kind of interesting to think about it from a different perspective, I think, in this century. In the past, we know of periods where the church very much influenced and controlled the culture. And what I see happening in the 20th century is churches being so much more influenced by the culture sometimes than the other way around. And so we see in some places the mega church and the emphasis on almost an entertainment kind of presentation in religious worshiping groups. And sometimes that can be good, and sometimes that's difficult to work with. And the media these days, that kind of people are used to that kind of presentation, has affected the way that we are gathering together as groups, especially in the Protestant tradition.
And also, what about the role of women in the church? I can't let anything go by without asking you about that.
Well, of course, that's a major change for many of us, that the mainline Protestant denominations have been in differing decades begun to ordain women. However, I really feel that the roots for that go all the way back to the Reformation and some changes in the status between men and women as the church was adjusting to that schism.
Well, maybe we'll get to talk about that some more, but I need to move right on to Tom. And we've kind of talked about generalities, and we've talked about some specifics in the trenches. Now, what's happening worldwide as well with other religions, perhaps not just in the United States?
Well, I think all of the religions have certain commonalities in their goals and objectives in dealing with people. I think all of the religions in the world, Christianity, Judaism, as well as the Asian religions, are trying to give people some sense of their place in the world, who they are, where they're coming from, where they're going, essentially supply people with answers to the meaning of life, as well as to provide the kind of social glue that helps different cultures identify and operate with certain values that are vitally important to community. And of course also religions are focusing on larger scale things like what happens after we die and issues of salvation and so forth. Up until the 20th century, I think this has happened in fairly traditional kinds of ways in agricultural and pastoral and to some extent industrial societies. And as Ron has indicated, with the collapse of the European colonial empire, particularly with the Second World War and following the Second World War, we see some very striking changes taking place in the world that I think the religions are trying to struggle with, what I call modernity. It's not just me calling it that, but essentially dealing with issues of social change that are brought about by industrialization, science, technology, materialism and consumerism, trying to develop our material state of being as well. This is causing a certain amount of conflict between our traditional ways in the religious world of dealing with human life and providing meaning. These different ways of looking at the world that come out of science and technology and humanism and so forth, skepticism about human destiny with regard to life after death and salvation and so forth, is causing all of the religions to struggle with these new perspectives that are providing challenges for the way we've traditionally looked at things. And I think you'll find that to be the case in Asia, India, China, as well, and Japan and Korea, as well as the Western world. And we find a worldwide kind of fundamentalist movement. We might want to talk about that later on as a reaction to these new developments.
I'm going to follow up on some of the things that Tom talked about, and I may be moving more into philosophy than I am into religion, but I hope we'll get somewhere with this line of questioning. I can remember picking up a book once, and I think it was in the Gonzaga Library, and it may have very well been about Gandhi, but some Eastern thinker was, I hate to use the term criticizing, but commenting on Western thought and issues of modernity and technology, and his concern was that Western people have embraced technology and they have knowledge without understanding. And I wonder if that's something we could talk about just in general terms. First, maybe discussing whether that's a religious issue or a philosophical issue.
Well, it might have been Gandhi because at one point, Gandhi was once asked the question, what did he think of Western civilization? And his reply was, well, he thought it would be a good idea. But, I mean, what that question gets at is, of course, that sort of the clash, you know, that we've already talked a little bit about, the clash between religion and culture, the sense of the idea, the search for meaning. So it's not simply just religions themselves giving people a sense of meaning. They're also kind of struggling with that as well. And a lot of that, I think, you know, has to do with you know, the rise of science, technology, those sorts of issues, the way in which that, in some respects, people argue that our technology has overreached our ability to reflect on it. And modernity is part of that process. So we, you know, things move forward very fast, but yet our reflective capabilities are kind of lagging. And that's sort of the tension that's at work there. So when you say, you know, we have all these things, but we're not wise about them, I mean, that's part of the reason behind that. I mean, Gandhi was being a little bit facetious. But he was also being critical, too, in terms of the whole issue about what are the values that are at stake, in what direction are we moving. And he was critical of what he saw as sort of the overwhelming influence of Western civilization, particularly industrialization in India at the time in which he was trying to deal with it. He was much more focused on the idea of the village. And that clash then between sort of village and civilization became a sort of a motif for him in terms of how he understood what was going on in India. But that's a way to look at that question.
How do the rest of you feel about some of those major issues? And the currents in world religion don't seem to be flowing all in the same direction. On the one hand, even in this country, there is, I think, a tendency on the part of some religions, maybe even some churches, to embrace technology and to use it to attract especially a younger audience back to church. But there are also currents running in the opposite direction in this country, back to a more conservative view of religion, and certainly that's the case in some other world religions, a real strong movement back to a fundamentalist conservative ideology in some areas. What direction do you see things moving?
It's interesting that some of those churches that are really capitalizing on the technological advances we've made are also the ones who hold a very conservative doctrine. So they are drawing in the young people and the large crowds and things like that. But I don't think it's only the technology that attracts the younger people. It's also the very black and white kind of presentation that they make of things. This is right, this is wrong. It seems like as we become increasingly complex in our society, that people enjoy having those kinds of very definite boundaries. So they don't have to be all that reflective sometimes, and can have someone else tell them what is safe and what isn't. And so we've seen such a growth in those conservative churches, I think, because of that's a place you can go and things are not as complex as they are in your work world or your family life or things like that. And that has contributed, of course, to the decline we've seen in the mainline denominations in the last couple decades.
And if Tony will allow me one more question, I should move back because we're supposed to be looking at a historical perspective here and ask Tom maybe to comment on whether or not these sorts of changes from progressive thinking to maybe more conservative thinking, however you want to cast them, are those new to recent developments in religion, or can we kind of watch those currents and those changes back through the history of organized religions?
Well, I'm not a terribly strong expert on the history of religions per se. I think these, as changes in society take place, various kinds of social and cultural innovations, whether it's in farming practices or technology, we're always seeing some swings back and forth between progressive and conservatism as religious institutions try to keep pace with and adjust to various changes in society. But I think these changes in the past have been much more gradual, have taken place over much longer spans of time. What we're seeing operate now are changes in technology, and I think this issue of complexity is a very important one, that are happening at such a rate that it's just completely outstripping people's ability to keep their values in touch with these changes, and maintain some sort of firm grounding. The world seems to be flying apart to a lot of people. And I think it's not only in the United States or even Western Europe that we see fundamentalism on the increase. It's the fastest growing, I guess, style of religion in Christianity, in Islam, to some extent even in Buddhism, though it would be a little different in that regard, but also I think in Hinduism as well. China is hard to gauge because they're still somewhat tied into the Marxist-Maoist kind of ideology, which is a species of religion in itself. But it does provide people with straightforward, clear-cut kinds of answers and some sort of solid grounding for the way the world works and our place in it and where we're going, that people are not able to identify as things change so rapidly. There's so much complexity. It's very difficult, I think, just to think straight in today's world for ordinary people, and so this this sort of change to a more conservative, more black or white kind of thinking is comforting to people, and is more precipitous now than we may have observed those kinds of patterns in the past.
One of the things that we just hinted at in the program already, and Tom, when he was talking earlier, the world religions have tremendous membership and have influenced the course of history. Can we take a moment to go through some of those that I identified? All of you have had some exposure in your academic work to different religious dogmas and principles. Give us 3 or 4 major principles or belief systems that one finds common in religions all over the world.
Boy. Well, I think certainly there's an element of some sense of right behavior. Now that might differ within each religious tradition, of course, but most of the religious traditions have some sense of that.
Within that dogma,
right.
They tell their people there's some things that are right and some are wrong.
Yeah, and as I say, that can vary within religious traditions, but there's clearly, I think, I would argue, a sense of that for sure. Whether you would want to say there's a belief in some sort of a deity, now there's variations on that even. Now clearly Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but when you get to Hinduism, it's much more complex than that. But there is that sense too. Buddhism, as Thomas said, is a little bit different focus, but I think certainly a certain sense of a right action, some sense of again, I'm a little bit hesitant to use the word afterlife. But whether that's in terms of a Christian context or whether it's in terms of more of an Eastern framework in terms of reincarnation, there is some sense of that too. So I would say at least those would be 2.
Let me interrupt again and say that all the great religions of the world believe that there is something after life, if it even involves reincarnation coming back. Or
well, I don't know if I'd say, again, all is, you say all, I'm not sure quite how we want to get it.
At least of the religions that I mentioned,
yeah.
Do all of those religions, or maybe Tom was coming on this, do they all believe that life does not end with death?
Maybe it would be better to think in terms of after death rather than after life,
right.
Yeah.
Because I think all of the Western religions, of course, are thinking in terms of some kind of continuity after death in another realm. In the religions from India, unless certain things are done by way of extinction of self, we come back into another human life via reincarnation. China, I suppose, from the standpoint of world religions, is at least traditional China, classical China, not so much contemporary China, although I think the folk beliefs of classical China still pervade most of Chinese society, but they're the most fortunate in the sense that everybody goes to heaven. After death, you simply move on to heaven as the sort of next stage, and I think all of this indicates that all of the world's religions are dealing with two really fundamental problems, in addition to getting along with each other, as Ron is suggesting, is the problem of suffering and the problem of death itself and the fear of death. And how do we cope with it? And what sort of schemas or value systems or ideas about some way of hanging on to life in some fashion can we be provided with to help us cope with these fears of death and deal with the real problem of suffering?
I would ask Pastor Lippard to elaborate upon this whole process. You know, we're really, through my question, suggesting that religion has a very major role to play in the meaning of life and afterlife. Since you also have followed carefully the development of Christianity and then the Protestant movement within that, and of course the Catholic faith has had tremendous influence in the world too. What is at the heart of what's being said here about, as an individual belonging to a major religion, what kind of comfort does that give one, or what kind of guidance does it give within this dogma principles we're talking about?
Well, I think it varies from culture to culture, but let's say in Western culture, as you know, we have a real strong denial system in place, and we are almost to the point where you might say that we worship youthfulness and health and all of those things that are antithetical to death in the most part. And so for some people, I think that practice of Christian religion, which holds an afterlife kind of value, is one more way of hedging your bet and not having to really deal with the problem of death. However, true Christianity in its roots is almost defined by death, and is not an avoidance, but it is a process of through death to an afterlife. Did that get at your question,
yes,
Tony?
Yes, it does. And I hear you saying too that they're with a belief system and meeting with other believers, and life is through cycles of up and down of happiness and tragedy and so forth, that there's also a great comfort that comes from that process.
Yeah, and sometimes in some Christian traditions, that comfort comes from kind of an otherworldliness that doesn't really deal with some of the problems of our society and the suffering and things that Tom mentioned. But on the other hand, there are those groups that are not quite as popular that do a lot of thinking and talking about suffering. The liberation movement that especially started in the Roman Catholic tradition and flourished also among the Lutherans has a lot to say about the place of suffering in this journey we call life on earth.
I have one final question before I go to the panel, and I just have to get this one in on this hour, and it's for anyone, and it's really an open-ended question. From the different religions that we have identified and looked at today, and if you go back historically, in the majority of the religions, do they tend to go one way or the other between two approaches? One is that God, from the perception of that particular religion, God is a loving God, and like what Tom's talking about concerning China, that everyone goes to heaven, or is there other religions that dominate that indicate that you walk a certain path or there's great punishment and hell and so forth? Do one of those two concepts tend to dominate more than the other when you look at all the world's religions?
Well, I'll pick up on that one first, I guess. I mean, you can see both of those things going on in the same tradition, sometimes even at the same time. So it's not necessarily a question of, say, for example, Christianity always talk about a loving God, or do we talk about, making judgments? So I think it's not a wishy-washy answer, but it's an attempt to kind of make it maybe a little bit more nuanced. So you do get an emphasis on as I said, kind of right action or right conduct or right belief even. And the negative side of that is, of course, if you don't do those right things, or if you have the wrong belief, you will then suffer the negative consequences of that, whatever that might happen to be. So there is kind of pressure to connect suffering and punishment with a failure. But on the other hand, there is also a sense of suffering as being redemptive. I mean, I again talk a little bit about Martin Luther King, talks about creative suffering and how suffering can overcome and how you can use suffering to do that. So I think both of those things are kind of running on parallel tracks, and sometimes they cross. So I think that's a good way to look at it.
I'd ask Kate to follow up on this by saying, too, if we, like we do in politics and other fields, you have ideological positions from conservative to liberal. Is conservative theology or liberal theology more to emphasize one than the other?
I think so. It's always a little bit difficult with the definition of those words,
Yes.
but the way I understand it, conservative tends a little more towards the judgmental view of God, that one needs to live and be a certain way. And however, the real extreme liberation theology also ends up falling kind of in that way, that you must be participating in this type of liberating of the oppressed to be validated. But I would say for the most part, most liberal theology is more the gracious, loving God kind of proclamation.
Tom, we've got the signal. We have 2 minutes left, but how about Asian religion in particular?
Well, the situation is quite different with the Asian religions. In the case of India, you have a very complex polytheism where people personalize some sort of deity figure that they can relate to in some way. But lying behind that is essentially a non-judgmental, impersonal Godhead called Brahman. The Buddha was silent on the question about God, so we don't really know quite what he had to think about that. He always refused to answer any such questions. In China, you don't have a God either. You have a sort of the Emperor of Heaven, who is sort of like the archetype ancestor. But everybody just goes to heaven as I say, the next step.
I'm going to have to interrupt. I got the signal. We're out of time. But the good news is, Tom and our other guest and panel will be back next week, and we'll continue to discuss this fascinating issue, religion. I want to thank Tom Flynn, Pastor Kate Lepard, and Dr. Ron Large for being our guest today, and thank you for coming back again next week. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this program as interesting as we have, and we invite you to be with us again next week when we will continue this discussion of world religions. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We welcome you back to part 2 of a 2-part series on the great religions of the world. And last week we talked a lot from a historical perspective over the centuries, in particular emphasizing the 20th century. We'll give some more emphasis to that, and then on the program today we'd like to project into the 21st century and beyond of what our guests think may happen as to the major religions and how they affect the course of human history. But before I introduce our guests, I want to say to our viewers that with today's program we conclude the 23rd year of the North Idaho College Public Forum, and next week we'll be coming to you moving into year number 24. And I'd be remiss if I did not thank our outstanding panel that's been with us a lot of years, and I want to thank Janelle Burke and Steve Shink for all the commitment, dedication you've given us this year, and you missed very few shows, and you have very busy schedules, and we thank you. You make this program what it is and the quality with your questions. And I also want to thank Lindy Turner, who's the technical director, and his staff for yet another really rewarding year for us, and we look forward to coming back next week with the 24th year. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome our guest back from last week that did such an outstanding job in sparking our interest on this important topic. I first of all welcome back to the program Tom Flynn, who is on the faculty at North Idaho College and chair of the Division of Social Sciences and teaches in the field of philosophy, and has also an excellent background in Asian religions. Tom, welcome back. We look forward to more dialogue. And we equally welcome Pastor Kate Lepard, who is the pastor of Our Savior Lutheran Church in Pinehurst, Idaho, and has a special interest in the Reformation in history of religion. And Kate, we look forward to having you again today here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And I'm also very pleased to have Dr. Ron Large, who is on the faculty at Gonzaga University in the Department of Religious Studies, and he comes to us with a long and distinguished background in academics and education and ethics, philosophy, and religion. Welcome.
Thank you.
And as always, as I said, I'm very pleased to have our panel, Janelle Burke and Steve Shink. And we'll change format a little bit because for our viewers who were not with us last week, but probably more important, those who were, got left hanging, Tom Flint, when you were answering my question, we ran out of time. And I'll ask the question again and let you elaborate upon it. I had asked the other guests near the end of the show that when you look at the great religions of the world and you look at the perspective of the conservative viewpoint compared with the more liberal viewpoint, did the particular religions look upon the fact that if you're more conservative, you look at a more of a punishment approach to certain behavior, and from the liberals more less punishment or more loving, and you were in the process of describing the Asian religion.
Basically contrasting the Asian religions with the Western ones in this perspective, in that the Asian religions, to the extent that they're theistic at all, which is doubtful with regard to Buddhism, tend to be pantheistic, where they identify the created world as some sort of manifestation of God's being rather than something separate. As such, when you get to the sort of transcendental ultimates of both India and China, you get Brahman in the case of India and Tao in the case of China. These are impersonal transcendental ultimates or godheads, if you will, and not personal savior beings. So you really don't have the sense of an external deity looking in on our lives, sort of summarizing them at the moment of death and then passing some sort of judgment or sentence on us based on our conduct, but rather the doctrine of karma has tended to pervade Asia. Even in China, which has been influenced by Buddhism for about 2,000 years, when it was brought to China around the time of Christ, has gradually adopted that point of view, so that you don't think so much in terms of punishment and rewards per se in an afterlife, but rather in terms of the consequences, the sort of moral consequences of your actions that result from your own choices. And it's sort of automatic, kind of like Newton's laws of for every action there's a reaction. For every moral act that we perform in the world, there are moral consequences that ultimately come back to us. So we decide our own fate, either in an afterlife, in the case of China, in heaven, or in a new birth, in the case of India and Buddhism, in this world, by our own decisions in this life, rather than having some sort of pronouncement. So it's pretty much up to us what we choose for ourselves in this regard, rather than punishment and reward being handed down from on high based on some assessment of our conduct.
So it's very different from Western religion.
Quite different.
Janelle Burke?
We talked a little bit last week about some of the historical perspectives, but Dr. Large, my first question is for you with regard to one of the significant events in this century has been Vatican II, of course, and changes in the Catholic Church. Can we look forward to more of those changes in the 21st century?
Well,
or a continuing of those
yeah,
ties?
yeah. I mean, Vatican II was really a watershed event, obviously, in the Catholic tradition, and I think for a couple of reasons. One is just the main focus of Vatican II itself was the role of the Church in the modern world. So we talked a little bit about this last time, was the struggle between religion and modernity. And in a way, Vatican II was an attempt to try to assess that relationship. I mean, how does the Church relate to the world? But what that did, it did tie the Church then into a whole host of issues, dealing with concepts of sexuality, social change. We also talked a little bit last time about the ordination of women. And so the Church has really had to grapple with those issues on a much more, I think, public way, certainly, than it used to in the past. I think whether we can see more of that, I think the format is clearly there. Since Vatican II, I just use the American experience as an example of that. The U.S. Catholic bishops have written, you might call them sort of, pastoral letters is what they are. The analogy would be sort of a position paper on a particular issue. In the early 1980s, they did one on war and peace. It was called The Challenge of Peace. And in the mid-80s, they did one called Economic Justice for All, which focused on economic issues, but the connection of those issues to a theological framework. So I think that process will continue in terms of looking at specific issues. And so I don't see a sense of kind of, closing in. Again, I just don't think that's possible. But the other thing Vatican II did, though, it did create a lot of debate within the Church as to what direction then that should take.
And that will continue?
Yeah, that'll certainly continue, yes.
And Kate, in terms of the Protestant mainline denominations, they have been experiencing some difficulties perhaps in maintaining their own unique characteristics. And of course we've seen the rise of the non-denominational movements. Would you care to comment on that? How that's taking place?
First I wanted to add something to what Ron had said, and I hadn't quite thought of this before, but position papers have become very popular among the Protestants also, and I don't know if that's kind of a reaction or if people are expecting that, and that's where we're seeing a lot of controversy in the mainline denominations over position papers, especially about sexuality, abortion, and some of those hot topics in politics these days also. Once again, as we talked a little bit about last week, I think that people with all these kinds of conversations going on are often drawn to the type of religious group that will state very clearly what their position is. The Protestants understand out of their roots in the Reformation that we live within the tension of accepting people, not always positions, and how are we still to live together as a community, and that we are to be inclusive and not exclusive. And so we're seeing some shift in where people are comfortable among the Protestants that's changing the demographics there.
And do you think leadership is continuing? Is leadership an issue in the Protestant mainline denominations?
What kind of leadership, especially?
I'm talking about hierarchy, church hierarchy leadership.
Yes. In the dialogues that are going on between, for instance, the Reformed and the Lutheran traditions and the Roman Catholic and Anglican and the Lutheran traditions, hierarchy is a very big issue because, of course, that was a major shift at the time of the Reformation. The church, I just describe it as the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican have kind of a top-down system. There are pronouncements made, and cardinals and bishops and others, priests, then carry those out. The Lutheran tradition has been that, and other Protestants, that the church belongs to the people, and through consensus or perhaps some other form, some of those kinds of decisions are made, and then the bishops implement them or give guidance or things like that. So that's where we're really coming up against each other in some of these dialogues on its structure.
But in the non-denominationals, they're often following a personality.
Yes, a personality. And if that personality moves on to another congregation, then they're kind of lost in terms of what is it that they do believe, what holds them together, and you often see schisms after that happens.
Now, in terms, Tom, of the ecumenical movement, will we see that worldwide, or will we continue to have a number of different kinds of religions?
It's hard to answer with any sort of uniform picture. I think within Islam, we're seeing increasing fundamentalist, which tends to be associated with the Shia, which is one of the main divisions within Islam, makes up about 10 or 15% of the population. But the Sunni, which is the mainstream, really aren't up against the kinds of fragmentation that we see within contemporary Christianity. So I don't think we'll see anything much like an ecumenical movement within Islam. We will continue to see the increase of fundamentalism within Islam, again, in response to modernity, I think, more than anything else. In India, though we're talking about large numbers of people, nearly 1 billion people, Hinduism tends to be fairly localized within India and Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and so forth. And there, in addition to coping with modernity, I think the struggle is more nationalism and dealing with its conflict with Islam in India and Pakistan. China will have to wait and see because China, traditional Chinese religion, which I think is still very pervasive and pronounced within the Chinese mind, has still been dominated by Maoist form of Marxism. And we'll have to see as that style and ideology begins to relax toward the end of this century, as we're seeing it do, what sort of forms resurgence in religion will take. But as far as any sort of ecumenical movement of the kind that we're looking at in Christianity, it's most noticed in Buddhism, which traditionally has been rather passive about the nature of society. It's focused more on the individual coping with the circumstances of their birth, which, like all of the Indian religions, is what we deserve, and therefore really not worth changing. We got what we deserve, so trying to improve material conditions in the world is not something that's been a focus of Hinduism or Buddhism. But now Buddhism in particular, which is very wide-ranging, especially in Asia, but increasingly to the West, is becoming more social activist, working out how to deal with the social issues of the day. And in that sense, you are seeing worldwide Buddhist conferences that are struggling with issues of abortion, sexuality, materialism, and so forth, as we find Christianity and Islam struggling with as well.
Please.
Yeah, let me add a little bit to that too. I think partially what's at work in terms of the ecumenical movement, or what we might look forward to in the future. I mean, one of the issues that that raises is a process of definition. In other words, one of the things that has driven religions and groups as well is who's in and who's out. Mm-hmm. And how do we define what makes us what we are? And so who's on the outside, who's on the inside? If you take a strictly ecumenical approach, those kinds of issues don't make as much sense anymore. And for some people, that's a very liberating process. If you view all religions as one, or some underlying unity underneath all religions, then the whole ecumenical movement becomes kind of a more positive thing. But if you view it as a loss of identity, or somehow a collapse of your basic beliefs, then it can create problems. So it depends on your own perspective as to how you begin to view that.
Steve Sheen.
I've got to start with a historical question, but it is a prelude to a question about the future. And it's something that Tom said that piqued my interest. Has there been in the past any episode similar to what happened in the Soviet bloc countries, where there was a systematic suppression of religious activity? Does that have, I mean, certainly groups have imposed religions on conquered people in the past, but has there been any other instance where a group has said no to religious activity and thought for a long period of time?
Well, I don't know, maybe Kate will want to say something, because the Reformation
yeah.
has ties in with that. So.
Well, I was thinking even further back than that. In the roots of Christianity, there became systematic persecution and execution, from the Roman Empire.
Yes.
But it wasn't against all religion, because the Greek cults were still tolerated and even venerated. And then, in the time of the Reformation, Martin Luther was not only excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, but he was also made an outlaw with a price on his head, and so had to hide out in disguise in a castle for some time, and those kinds of things, and eventually that all led to war. So there have been those.
What I was leading up to was the thought that came to me that here is an opportunity to view something that maybe hasn't happened before in history. A generation of people who have been very systematically and thoroughly taught or discouraged from religious belief now have had that restraint lifted. And I'm wondering if you wanted to discuss for just a few minutes what you see happening in the next century in terms of that group of people. Is that a wonderful place for religious revival? Are we going to see people who, not having any antecedent of religious thought, simply turn away from religion? What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, part of what we need to understand is that they were not successful in stamping out religion in the Soviet Union. In many of the Christian traditions, the priests were, most of them, executed. And so it fell to the women to continue the teachings, the catechetical work, passing on the hymnody, all those kinds of things. So there has been an underground church, so to speak, in the Soviet Union. And now at the very... for instance, in East Germany, at the very beginning, the church really flourished as an arena of liberation, because that is where some of the impetus came from for the overthrowing of the wall, if you wanted to describe it that way. But that's kind of died down, some of the excitement. In Latvia and some of those Slavic countries, people are restoring churches with great enthusiasm and gathering together again.
Let me ask a related question, and it's another kind of a futurist question. What do each of you think the next century is going to hold in terms of a sort of a my religion versus your religion question? Are we moving into a century where there will be greater respect and tolerance of different religious opinion, or do you expect to see? And I don't want to indicate that some of the major conflicts that have occurred in the past are necessarily the result of religion as opposed to the result of people acting in the name of their religion. But will we see some of the same kinds of conflicts that have occurred in the past in the next century?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I think, quite from my point of view anyway, pretty difficult to answer. On the one hand, we in the modern world with the modern media are in a very fortunate position that people have never been in before in the past, where we can look at all of the world's major religions and see the commonality of values and so forth. And one would wonder if somehow or other there wouldn't be some new synthesis or fusion or some totally worldwide ecumenical movement, not only between or among Christian churches, but also inclusive of non-Christian churches as well. It would seem that some new kind of fusion or synthesis of the great religions is, for the first time, even possible. But on the other hand, as we were discussing earlier, as people continually struggle with complexity and modernity, I also wonder if we won't see more and more fragmentation into sort of local, pluralistic kind of enclaves. Whether people will be more or less tolerant along those lines, I don't know, but I suspect that as population increases, and as land and resources decrease, we may find that religion will once again be used as pretext for people to get some piece of the ever-diminishing pie while there's some pie left. So on the one hand, we have some prospects for some magnificent new religious tradition that might emerge out of the fusion of the traditions that we all have access to now. On the other hand, we may see a terrible breakdown, the likes of which we've never seen before, and greater conflict than we've ever known before. I sure have my eye on the next century that way.
What Tom has just been describing, we theologically call sin. And we don't really, I don't think, expect it to diminish in the next century. We tend to be competitive. Grabbing our piece of the pie is a real good way to define it. And so, although there are, on the liberal end of things in the many of the mainline groups, I see more consensus and more sharing of ministry in the mission field and many other places. On the other end, there will still continue to be that competitiveness that is part of our sinful nature that says ours is better than yours, and we have the direct pipeline to God. And so I don't really look for much of that to change.
Yeah, I just want to add to everything that we've been talking about. I think part of the problem is that is a process of self-definition. In other words, if you define yourself, and I'll put that in a religious context, as a religious person or your beliefs, in terms of contrasting that with others, then it's going to be almost impossible to create a more kind of a fusion in that regard. It's just simply not going to work, because if you do that, you're losing what you are. And if you understand religion as being at least having some impact on a person's core sense of him or herself or their idea of values, it's going to be very difficult to do that. So the tension comes in that clash. In other words, does this mean I'm giving up now who I am? Now, if you define yourself or you see your religious framework of being more, able to handle more doubt, perhaps, I don't know if that's quite the right way to put it, but then I don't think it's going to be that much of a problem. But in terms of moving to some broader, like a one kind of religion, I don't see it moving in that direction. I see maybe more of a sense of toleration for other religious traditions, but not a creation of sort of a new religion, although I could be wrong.
I think Christianity and some of the the ancestor type religions have at least something to offer the world also in terms of the sense of community, that it is the community that is important and not just the individual. And from my perspective, our society really needs that kind of an emphasis right now.
When you go back historically and you look at the world's religions and then also movements within a particular religion, there have been personalities that have been incredibly dynamic and, again, dealt with the course of history. And Kate, you were talking about Martin Luther and what that did in the Reformation. We can look at what Tom was talking about and the role of Buddha or Mohammed or others. Certainly they have left their mark with a huge number of people. As we move into the 21st century, will we be pretty much following the teachings of those religious leaders and others I have not mentioned, or do you see some others that have come on the scene in the 20th century that will impact in that way in the 21st century and be added? I'm not suggesting that those such as I have mentioned will not continue to have great impact, but will they be added to by any that you see on the horizon? Who wishes to take that question?
Well, if you look at the teachings of the founders of the world's religions, whether we're speaking about Judaism doesn't really have an individual founder, but if we're talking about people like Abraham and Moses and the prophets, and if we're talking about Jesus Christ and Christianity, or Muhammad's revelation of the Quran to people, the Buddha's teaching, Confucius' teachings, the teachings of the Taoist, they're remarkably similar. So I don't know that anybody's going to come on the scene in the future and add anything very much new.
Are we talking about continued development or understanding of what it's already been?
Well, I would hope to see, when I speak of a fusion, I'm not so much saying that there's going to be some totally new religion, but a fusion in the sense that we understand the commonality of the teachings of the world religions, and that we can give our identification, our sense of identity and fidelity to a particular tradition, to Islam or to Buddhism or to Christianity, without it being an us or them sort of a situation anymore. This is what I would certainly like to see happen, that there will be some sense of, well, I suppose what the New Age people call spirituality, which at least has the virtue of identifying with a certain kind of universal tolerance and core of human values that all of these religions have been trying to give to their different cultures. So I see religions trying to find new and appropriate ways of providing this kind of groundwork in values and hope and goodness.
On that note, I have to bring our program to conclusion. I've had the signal again that time has flown by. I want to thank Ron Large, Kate Lepard, and Tom Flint for being with us for 2 weeks on the topic of world religions, and the panel again for their outstanding questions. And ladies and gentlemen, as I said at the beginning of the program, this concludes the 23rd year of the North Idaho College Public Forum. We'll be with you next year to commence the 24th year, and we hope you'll be viewing us in the coming year as we deal with a great variety of subjects. I would like to wish each of you a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.